Aviophobia, by Stephen Lake. John quietly scanned the airport's main lobby around him, and marveled at the huge lines, and the thick press of bodies that was gathered there. He hated traveling during the holidays, and this was a perfect example of why he did. He studied the rows upon rows of people waiting patiently in line in front of him, complete with crying babies, noisy animals, screaming kids, people talking on their cell phones at the top of their lungs, and more. Next to him stood a woman in a pink coat, pink hat, with pink booties, and pink luggage. If she'd painted her face pink as well, it would have completed the look. He then noticed a grumpy old lady not far ahead of him in line, followed by a grumpy businessman and two grumpy kids. The TSA screeners didn't look any happier themselves. This outrageous backlog had to have them in fits as well. And it wasn't as though the screening lines were stalled. In fact, they were moving almost too fast in some respects. Yet, despite this, the size of the crowd was continuing to grow larger and larger, with more and more packing in behind them as time went along. He covered his mouth as he yawned, and then repositioned himself on top of his suitcases before looking at his watch as he sighed heavily. He still needed to check in his luggage before he went through the screening line. But the chances of that happening anytime soon were pretty slim at best, given how tightly packed the arrival area was. He then looked behind himself and noticed people stacked 5 and 6 deep outside the doors with no room left to come inside. At least he wasn't standing in the frigid cold like they were. He then looked at his watch again and wondered when he might get through this crowd so he could check in his bags. After that, he needed to figure out where the end of the security line was. Hopefully it hadn't extended outside the building too. Although, given what he was seeing, that was entirely possible. Eventually the crowd ahead of him thinned, allowing him to finally reach the check-in counter for the airline. The woman at the counter greeted him nicely enough, and then started talking non-stop for what seemed like forever, asking him dozens of seemingly mundane questions that had absolutely nothing to do with his trip. Eventually she took his bags, and gave him his receipt. John sighed at this in relief. Next was the mess gathered in front of the security checkpoint. He walked over to the lines waiting to go in, and soon found the end. To his great surprise, most of the people who had been waiting to enter were finally able to. Even the end of the security screening line had finally made its way inside. So, while he found himself pressed against the outside doors, he was still thankfully indoors. But that wasn't much of a consolation, as the line seemed to stall for the better part of an hour, neither moving nor changing, despite the number of people flowing through the checkpoint. He looked at his watch again. If they didn't hurry, he would be late for his flight. Finally the line started moving again, and it wasn't long before he found himself at the front of it. The TSA agent who was monitoring the gate into the scanning area motioned for him to approach, and then blinked as though he'd just seen a ghost. The agent quickly shook it off, and soon went back to his work. He took John's boarding pass, examined it, gave John a second look, and then let him through. John put his small carry-on bag into the bin, followed by his shoes, watch, belt, hat, phone, wallet, and close to half his wardrobe. John felt almost naked by the time he stepped up to the metal detector. The guard on the other side noticed his somewhat embarrassed expression as he did his best to keep his pants from falling down around his ankles. She grinned, and then motioned for him to step forward. As soon as he did, the detector began going off. It made such a racket that everyone plugged their ears because of the intensity of the sound. John merely grimaced and endured the painfully loud blare of the siren, as he didn't dare let go of his pants. Finally, one of the guards reached up, pressed the reset button and asked him to step back. She then motioned for him to step forward again, and this time he passed through it without the alarm making a sound. John grinned sheepishly, and began collecting his belongings. He tossed his 2 tubs into a nearby pile, and soon made his way down the concourse to his gate. As he did, he stopped at one of the local shops with the intention of buying a cup of coffee to drink. However, before he could, a stranger walked up to him, and began screaming wild insults at him. John blinked in surprise, and then tried his best to ask the man what had happened. But the man didn't stop. He only shouted louder and more vulgar profanities and insults at John, adding to his growing confusion. Eventually the man started shoving John angrily, which eventually drew the attention of several nearby security agents. The agents then quickly grabbed the man, and forcefully separated him from the target of his anger. John was now glad that he hadn't gotten his coffee yet, as he would have been generously burned by now if he had. He then looked at the security guards, and nodded his thanks. Thinking that this was over, he was surprised when the guards then turned on him as though he were at fault. "Sir, why were you just attacking this man?" asked one of the guards. John blinked in disbelief. "Me? Attacking him? No, sir. He was attacking me. I was just standing here, trying to buy a cup of coffee, when he walked up to me and started acting like I'd kicked his favorite dog or something," he said. "That little worm was messing with my wife," screamed the man. "Your wife? I don't even know who you're talking about. In fact, I've never even seen you before," cried John. "Yes, you have. You're the one who messed with my wife, and then got our flight cancelled after you bum-rushed the boarding agent, poured coffee on the pilot and started trashing the plane. Why aren't you in jail, you animal?" cried the man. John blinked in surprise. "Say what?" he exclaimed. "Wait, I heard about that incident. Hold on a second. You're that guy we saw on the security brief. How in the world did you get back in here?" said one of the guards. "I honestly have no idea what you're talking about, sir," replied John. "Oh yes you do. I hope they hang you from a support beam, you scumbag," cried the man. "All right, sir, that's enough," said one of the officers as he tried to placate the angry man. His partner then turned to John and said, "Sir, I'm gonna need you to come with me. We need to have a little chat." John sighed in frustration, and then followed the man into a nearby hallway. After nearly 2 hours of intense interrogation, it was discovered that John was in fact not the man they thought he was. Instead, it turned out that he very unfortunately looked exactly like another man who had been arrested earlier that day in the airport, and hauled away to the local jail where he was currently undergoing a long and detailed psychiatric evaluation. The security guards apologized for the confusion, and then released him to his flight. But, by the time they did, his flight had already left. So he was escorted over to the airline offices where he was rebooked on another flight which was scheduled to leave an hour later. The guards made sure he got on the flight, into his seat, and that everything was all right before parting ways with him. The plane then took off on schedule and, once in the air, John finally felt that it was safe to relax. He was thankful that the next several hours of travel were generally boring. The only thing that he hated about it was that the seats were too narrow, there wasn't enough legroom, and the drinks were far too expensive. It was one of the reasons he quite fondly called the economy section cattle class, as he felt like a piece of livestock on the way to the slaughterhouse. To make matters worse, the guy next to him was excessively chatty, and talked like he was in a speed reading contest, never shutting up, and never seeming to ever take a breath. He just continued talking, and talking, and talking as though powered by a super-endowed set of lungs with an infinite supply of air. Eventually though, they began their descent to their final destination, and by some miracle of miracles, the guy next to him actually shut up and didn't utter a peep the rest of the flight. As John situated himself for the eventual landing, a plank of surprised gasps and nervous talking arose from the other passengers around him. A moment later he heard the landing gear go back up and the engines increased to full power as the aircraft started to ascend again. This confused him. Weren't they just coming in to land a moment earlier? To further increase his curiosity, he noticed that quite a few people were leaning over and looking out the windows. Finally, unable to contain himself, he leaned over the guy next to him and glanced out his window. To his complete surprise and horror, he could see dozens of thick, black columns of smoke rising into the sky above buildings that were gushing with flames. His eyes went wide. Fires, bodies, destroyed buildings, and carnage were everywhere. It was as though the entire city had come apart below them. Passengers, it appears that a natural disaster has just occurred below us and, as such, we will not be landing at our original intended destination. Instead, we're making best time to a nearby airport not far from here. So please stay seated with your belts fastened, and we'll be on the ground as soon as we can," came the captain's voice over the intercom. But that did little to allay the fears of the passengers. Even the flight attendants appeared struck with fear, despite doing their best to remain calm and appear courageous to the passengers all around them. The airplane continued on for another 20 minutes, before again lowering its landing gear, as it prepared to land. But then the unthinkable happened. There was a sudden, loud bang that shook the aircraft violently. Moments later, to everyone's horror, the wings came off. John gripped his seat in abject terror and disbelief as his body became weightless for the brief few seconds it took for the plane to plummet the short distance to the ground. The moment the plane hit, John heard a gut-wrenching roar, the sound of rending metal, and saw a wall of flames race through the cabin and engulf everything around him. A split second later John snapped awake and sat bolt upright in his bed. He was breathing heavily and his body was covered in sweat as he did. He then looked around the room frantically as he continued to pant anxiously. For a brief moment his mind was filled with confusion, which quickly settled into astonished relief. It had only been a dream. But what a dream it was, and so vivid too. He slowly climbed out of bed, walked over to the window, and threw open the drapes. The sky was clear, the ground snow-covered and white, and everything was peaceful in the world around him. He then looked over at his luggage, which sat next to the bed ready to go on whatever adventure he chose today, and wondered if his dream had really been a dream, or instead an eerie premonition. It had obviously not been real, and yet it was far too clear and vivid to be anything else. He shook it off, climbed out of bed, and took a shower. He had to drive the fear of flying from his mind, or it would bother him all day. He then shaved, dressed, ate his breakfast, and caught a ride to the airport with his friend. But when they arrived at the drop-off location, he noticed that the line at the check-in counter was out the door, and the lines at the TSA security checkpoint were equally as bad. To his complete disbelief, it was exactly as he'd seen in his dream that night. But that wasn't what bothered him the most. As he scanned the crowds of people waiting in line, he noticed that everything was exactly identical to what he'd seen in his dream. Everyone was wearing the exact same clothing, had the exact same luggage, stood in the exact same spots, and in the exact same order as before. Even the lady in pink he'd seen in his dream was there. A cold chill ran down his back. "What's the matter?" asked his friend. "I saw this in my dreams last night. I mean this exact scenario, right down to the lines, the luggage, the people, everything. Even that weird lady in pink was there," said John. "Nah, you're seeing things, man. It's just flight jitters," replied his friend. But John couldn't be swayed. "I can't go, man. I just can't," he said anxiously. "What? No way, man. Don't back out now." "I can't, I'm gonna die and I know it." "What are you talking about?" asked his friend. Just then a police car pulled into the slot just in front of them. A moment later, 3 TSA agents stepped through the doors escorting a man in handcuffs. The man looked at John, and then gave him a devilish, seditious grin. John gasped at this in both shock and horror. The man looked exactly like him, right down to the outfit he was wearing and everything. John pointed at him, and said, "Then explain that. That guy looks just like me. Exactly like me. I mean, he's literally my twin." John's friend looked at the man, then at John, and then back at the man as he was being shoved into the car. He then threw the vehicle into drive, and began to pull away. "You know, just this once I think it'd be wise to listen to your fears," he replied. "So you saw him too, right?" asked John. "I did, but he didn't look like you. He looked like me. An evil me. And he mouthed to me the words, 'Enjoy your trip. I'll see you on the Beltline,' just as they shoved him into the car," said his friend, a hint of fear in his voice. Upon hearing this, John grabbed his friend's arm, and said, "Get out. I'm driving." "What? If that's death, and he's out to get us both, then I'd rather be the one driving." "Why?" John grinned. "If he sees me at the wheel instead of you, it might confuse him enough to allow us to escape. And, if luck holds out, we might even get out of this alive." His friend laughed. You know, you're weird sometimes. But in this case, I think it's the kind of weird I can live with. The end.